Um, so today I'm going to have a chat with Elizabeth Brooks about her second novel, The Whispering House, which is out from Doubleday today. And here it is, looking absolutely beautiful. Elizabeth's first novel, The Call of the Curlew, was published 2 years ago. Set in a house surrounded by eerie marshes. The action largely takes place during the Second World War. And for The Whispering House, which I'd say has a very similar vibe, it's contemporary set. We just had a quote sent through from Elizabeth's American publisher, from Renee Denfield, who's author of The Childfinder, who says, "Shimmering, lush, with prose that beats at the heart, The Whispering House will keep you up all night. Elizabeth Brooks has written a Gothic mystery like no other." So with that tantalising quote in hand, perhaps you'd like to start things off by giving us a brief description or rundown of the novel.
Sure, yes. It's a story about a young woman called Freya, who's really traumatized by the suicide or apparent suicide of her sister several years before. And the story kicks off at this beautiful stately home where there's a wedding reception, and she's there as a bridesmaid. So the guests aren't allowed inside the house, but Freya trespasses inside when she finds this portrait, which really intrigues her because it bears a resemblance to her dead sister, and she'd no idea that her sister had any connection with the house at all. And so she sort of draws her into the house, really, and she becomes embroiled with the family who own the place, the artist, Cory, and his mother. And lots of because their world, and becomes all tied up with her sort of this slightly claustrophobic relationship with the artist. And I think if I say any more, I'll probably give too much away. So.
We don't want to give too much away. That's very intriguing. So one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is that both your novels concern isolation. So in Call of the Curlew, we've got the physical isolation of the house on the marshes, and in The Whispering House we've got both the physical isolation and also the psychological isolation through Cory's manipulation of Freya. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you're drawn to put your characters in these very trying situations.
Yes. I'm quite mean to my characters. But I think the sort of isolation in both the books is quite different, in the sense that in Call of the Curlew, I think, although Virginia is very isolated on the marsh, I think in her own way she's quite happy. She's got this very rich internal imaginative world which she kind of draws on. And yeah, it's probably not a great way to be, but in some ways she's happy in her own way. Whereas I think Freya's isolation in The Whispering House is much more frightening, because she's someone who's quite hungry for life and love, and she doesn't want to be alone. And I was quite interested in, there's been a lot in the media sort of over the last few years about domestic abuse and the sort of subtle forms it can take, where it's not necessarily someone being beaten up or whatever, but having your sort of sense of self undermined, and being made to, being manipulated to make you feel like you're in the wrong or you're going mad or whatever. So I think that's sort of what I want to explore with Freya.
Gaslighting.
Yes, gaslighting, exactly, yeah. And I think also with Freya, she starts off the book with quite a lot of baggage. She's got a lot of grief and guilt and anger, and maybe by isolating her, she's right down to her essential.
Yeah,
is going to pull through this. She has to start from there, I think.
Yeah,
maybe that's
interesting. Yeah, poor characters. you really
yeah, no pity.
So just leading on from that, the novel has a Gothic atmosphere, which I love. I know loads of readers who love that kind of Gothic aspect to your writing. And personally, I'm a huge fan of ghost stories. And while The Whispering House, although it has kind of ghostly elements, it's not an actual ghost story. I just wondered if you did have a favourite ghost story or Gothic novel yourself.
Yeah, I think I've always liked that sort of, even looking back to the books I liked as a child, it's the things that stay with me are the kind of, I always think about the chapter in the FG where Sophie is lying in her bed in the moonlight and the witching hour, and that it sort of Tom's Midnight Garden and things with sort of people walking around house at night and strange noises. So yeah, I mean, I think when I started writing seriously, I really wanted to write a classic ghost story. That was kind of what I felt I ought to be doing, as you probably remember.
Yeah. I do, yeah.
It's an incredibly difficult thing to pull off. I mean, there are ghost stories I really love and that really work, like the Michelle Paver Dark Matter. I loved.
It's one of my favorites. Yeah.
And The Woman in Black.
Yeah,
but it's I find it such a difficult thing to write a proper classic ghost story with actual ghosts, because it teeters on the brink of silliness sometimes. It's very difficult to make it properly frightening and
keep the sort of that suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, that's exactly. So I think I've sort of fallen out of love with the idea of actually writing a proper ghost story, but I love keeping that atmosphere, as you say. And I think the book that probably influenced this most is Rebecca, I think, because that is a ghost story really, but it's the classic example of the ghost story without there's no apparitions or clanking of chains or whatever. No. But the house is haunted by Rebecca.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just by the fact that her scent is in the air and her name is on the headed notepaper in the desk, and she's everywhere.
Yeah,
it's so clever.
Yeah,
because it's got that. It's got the ghost without the ghost in a way. So I think that was probably my favourite and my main influence, if you can count it as a ghost story.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Also a favourite of mine.
Yeah.
So as an agent, I get lots of insight into different ways that people approach their writing, and I always find it endlessly fascinating. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your own writing process, and also how did the writing of this second novel differ perhaps to the writing of your first one?
Okay, yeah. So the writing process, I haven't really found the perfect formula yet for writing. I'd love to know how you just sort of set off and do it, because you know what you're doing, but every time it's different. And with Follow the Curlew, it flowed really easily, I think, once I got started. And the final version was pretty much the same as the first draft. I mean, there were plenty of edits to do, but the basic shape was. But the Whispering House was more difficult. It was a bit more like putting a puzzle together or something. It was. I did do a fairly quick first draft, but that felt quite short and quite sort of thin, really. That was just in Freya's first person voice. So then I kept sort of adding to it, really. I sort of read it through and thought, well, it needs somebody else's voice in, so I added new sections of somebody else's voice. And then every time I changed it, it sort of showed up some other weakness, and I was I need perspective from this person. So it was much more a case of building it up and sort of
like it was almost more difficult the second.
It wasn't necessarily less enjoyable in a way, but it was more difficult. It was more of a puzzle. It was more like, how do I get this right?
The natural assumption would be that it would be kind of easier with the next one, but I
suppose sadly not. yeah.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, I just always find you get there's so many different sort of schools of thought, aren't there, about how best to write, and I suppose everyone's just got their own way of doing it.
Yes.
So obviously this is your second novel, so we can consider you an old hand. So I just wondered if you had any tips for aspiring authors.
Oh gosh, I don't feel like an old hand. Every time I start a new project, I think, how do I do this again? Well, I think the main piece of advice I'd give any aspiring author is to read a lot. I think read and read and read, and not just necessarily the genre that you want to write in, but really widely, and because you never know where your influences come from. And I think just read. I mean, obviously read for enjoyment, but read critically as well, and just sort of notice as you're reading what works and what you don't like and what you might use. And it's not. I don't mean in a sort of plagiarism way, or that you want to start parroting your favourite authors or anything. It's much more kind of like a osmosis sort of thing. I think the more you read, the more you kind of, it's like they all compost down inside you, and then you eventually, I think, find your own voice through all those influences.
Yeah.
So I think, read and read.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. Yeah. One of the protagonists who you've already mentioned, Cory, is an artist, a troubled artist, we could say.
Yes.
Did you draw his character from any particular artist, or do you have a favourite artist that you were thinking about?
Yeah.
Portrayal.
When I didn't draw him from a particular artist, but I suppose I vaguely had in mind those sort of pre-Raphaelite Victorian artists, like Rossetti, with those very romantic sort of portraits of women in medieval or classical sort of garb. I used to think they were amazing and wonderful when I was a teenager. I thought they were so romantic, and they're very sort of lush and sensual. But I suppose I see them a bit more critically now. I mean, I don't not like them anymore, but I find them a bit more troubling. I think the women in them often look quite.
They're so sort of passive and forlorn looking.
They're so passive. They're so sort of sleepy, aren't they? And yes, and yeah, I think that was quite a big influence. That sort of they look to me quite sort of sad and lost. Some of those women, and I think some of them, the actual models, had quite sad backstories as well. And so that was. I wouldn't say they were my favourite anymore, although they probably were when I was about 16. But I think my favourite artist is probably Marc Chagall, the Russian. Yeah, I just love that. That's sort of the opposite of the paintings in the book. Really, they're so full of warmth and sort of lyricism.
Yeah, brilliant. And then just a few quick questions to finish off. What has been your favourite recent read? And by that I probably mean like lockdown read.
Yes. So yes, Tigers in Red Weather by Lisa Klausman, which is, I think it was published back in 2012, but it was just the perfect heatwave book because it's got such a wonderful, sultry, kind of thundery atmosphere. It's just amazing. It's set in a heatwave in New England in the 1950s. And it's about two women who are friends, and they got married. They both got married at the end of the Second World War, and when it all in a sort of period of such sort of possibility and ferment, and they were really excited about what they were going to do with their lives. But then they end up as the sort of classic 1950s housewives in this sort of suburban New England heat wave summer, and it's just so atmospheric. There's lots of martini drinking and tennis playing, and it's quite sort of Gatsby-ish. There is a sort of thriller element. There's a dead body that is quite important to the plot, but it's not. It's sort of more about that kind of that kind of rotten atmosphere where it's all a beautiful facade, but there's something rotten underneath. It's great. Yeah,
sounds brilliant. And then the one we always like to ask is, if you had a desert island book, so if you could take just one book to a desert island, which one would it be?
Well, I'd probably have to go for an old favourite, I think, which would be, I think it would be Jane Eyre, because that's kind of my first and sort of favourite, I think. It's one of those books I think you can read so much into it with each reading, which is important. You're stuck with just one book. So you can, like when I first read it, when I was whatever age I was, I think I was quite straightforwardly sort of in love with Mr. Rochester, and the wife in the attic was just and I died off, and it was all. But then when you go back, when you're older and read it, it's so much more interesting to sort of think about her and who she is, and maybe to question whether Mr. Rochester is as great as he made out to, or maybe is made out to be by Charlotte Bronte. And every time you go back you read it differently, so I think that would keep me going. All right.
Brilliant. Great, well, thanks very much.